Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, everybody, to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm Anna Kate, and I am joined today by Amanda C. Knight, who is adjunct instructor of Latin and religion at Longwood University. She holds a PhD from Emory University, and we're here today to talk about her new book, Seeing, Knowing, Becoming, Sense Perception as Metaphor in Augustine. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We're so glad to have you. So let's jump right in. You're kind of taking Augustine and you're using his work to kind of just uncover this idea of sense perception as a metaphor. And so you argue that Augustine's talk about eyes, light, and perception is more than just an illustration, but it organizes his thinking. So what first convinced you that the metaphor was doing conceptual work and not just rhetorical work?
Yeah. It's a funny question because this whole book was really like accidental. Like I just kind of stumbled upon the idea. I was originally interested in like the theology of the body. So I was reading Augustine on the body and, I didn't know like what I would find. I was just hoping to find something interesting. And was getting into sense perception because he talks about that a lot when he talks about the body. And then I noticed when I was trying to understand his theory, because his theory really isn't all that easy to understand. It's kind of vague.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm trying to, wrap my mind around how exactly he thinks sense perception works. And I started with pain and pleasure. And I had just done a seminar on Augustine where we focused a lot on his moral psychology. And so once the stuff about pain and pleasure became clear to me, I just thought like, boy, this sounds an awful lot like the will, like grace, like all these things. It's like, well, maybe it's coincidental. I think
Right.
Augustine is a really systematic thinker, so coincidental. And then as I'm continuing to pursue the sense perception stuff, I get into harmony and how that is like the basis of pain and pleasure. And that gets me into measure, number, and weight, his ontological triad. And I think, can this stuff be applied to the soul? And I discover it can, such that what occasions physical pleasure is very like analogous to what occasions delight, like psychological delight. But at that point, it's like, well, okay, these are like principles that Augustine would apply to all of creation. And then I got into epistemology. And once I saw that reason, like the power of rationality, is an intermediary that's very much like how the pneumatic material works in our sense organs. And then the final clincher for me was really that Augustine has this idea, this concept that I call the psychological image. And the way that mediates between like the corporeal, sensible world and the soul is just really precisely how the incarnate Christ functions as an intermediary to our fallen minds. So at that point, it's like, well, I guess this is a book, and I like this can't be coincidental in my mind. It was too precise. So yeah, I just stumbled upon it.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting how you describe your pursuit as beginning with a study of the theology of the body, and that has kind of led to then this sense perception and also like the somatic elements, that it's not just body as in our physical bodies, but kind of what you're describing seems like an embodied experience. Would you say?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and as far as I do argue in the book that sense perception, I think it's a metaphor that organizes his thinking. And
Right.
I know that not everyone is gonna be convinced by that. I know
Sure.
that's
Yeah.
a pretty big argument, but I'm hoping that even for my readers who are not convinced about how Augustine is thinking, that each individual analogy that I draw out will at least be illuminating.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so let's get into these analogies. And so you break Augustine's account into three loci. The
Mhm,
first is the soul's active role. So you talk about animating attention, and then interruption and
mhm,
assimilation with pleasure and pain, depending on how easily the interruption is absorbed. So you have this animating attention, and then there's an
mhm.
interruption,
Yep.
and then it kind of assimilates. And so this is with you're kind of trying to determine how easily the interruption is absorbed. And so unpack that sequence for us, the way that it's absorbed, and then kind of the three layers there that you point to.
Yeah, so, here's where, Augustine is vague, and I
Yeah.
should say at the outset that, he's not a specialist, and he doesn't this isn't a theory that he came up with. He's just a well-educated guy, he has, some awareness of ancient science and but he's not a specialist, so he's not interested in, like, the really nuanced points or debates. So
Right.
when you're reading his account of sense perception, you have all these questions like, well, you know, how sometimes you're talking about movement and other times you're talking about images. So, what's going on there? Um, but yes, so my account is trying to fill in some gaps that or and answer some questions that he leaves us with.
Yeah.
Okay, so right, animating attention. Um, Augustine thinks that because the soul is superior to the body, the soul has to be in the driver's seat. The soul has to be in
Uh,
charge of sense perception. The soul is the active agent, the body is passive. And so the soul is in control and drives this material through the body, a material that I call
mm,
pneumatic material, based on pneuma, the Greek word, which we often translate as spirit. But according to the Stoics, pneuma is corporeal. It's almost like how
mm,
we would think of like gaseous elements that are really airy, but they're corporeal. So the soul drives this pneumatic material through the body into sense organs, like my nose and my eyes and my ears. And the soul is like keeping this pneumatic material in perpetual motion,
mm,
in like a pattern of motion in my sense organ. And this pattern of motion, it seems like prepares the soul to notice an interference.
yeah.
So that is the state that I call animating attention. That's just the soul driving this pneumatic material into the sense organs and like keeping it going in these patterns of
Right.
motion. So then what happens when I perceive something is there's an encounter between my sense
Mm,
organ and some object, some sensible object, and that encounter interrupts the patterns of motion. So you could
mm,
think of it like some guy swimming laps in a pool, and then a kid cannonballs in there. It's like, oh, interruption, interruption of the
right.
patterns of motion that were going on.
Yeah.
So then that interruption makes the soul pay more attention to what happened.
Mm,
It induces the soul's attention in a state that I call perceptive attention. And
mm-hmm.
perceptive attention is when the soul has to like resume the patterns of motion that it had before, but it's got to assimilate this interruption.
Mm,
And
mm-hmm.
if its attempt to assimilate this interruption is easy, then I feel pleasure. And
Yeah.
if its attempt to assimilate the interruption is hard, then I feel pain.
Mm.
So that's how every instance of pain and pleasure can be explained according to this schema, where I've got this pattern of motion going in the sense organ, and then it's interrupted, um, and then the soul has to assimilate the interruption, and the relationship um, between like the movement of the interruption and the patterns of motion that originally animated the sense organ, the relationship between those determines whether it's easy or hard and whether I
Mm.
experience pleasure or pain.
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction that you're making there is it's not the interruption that determines whether or not it's pleasure or pain, but actually the way that the soul reacts to it and
Mhm.
the I guess assimilability, the ability
Mhm.
of the soul to assimilate what it has perceived is
Mhm.
really what's determining whether or not it's pain or pleasure. And I think that is just such an interesting distinction because um yeah, I liked your analogy of the a person, cannonballing into the pool in front of a lap swimmer.
Yep.
But yeah, that the interruption isn't necessarily what's causing the pain or pleasure, but it's whether or not you can continue forward and how
Right.
hard or how easy that is. That's really determining whether or not it's pain or pleasure.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not that an interruption is inherently painful or pleasurable. It's the relationship
Right.
between the movement of that interruption and the movement that was in the sense organ before.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Wow. So let's move on to the second locus. So that's the first one. The second locus is that we take pleasure in what is like us. So
Mhm.
Augustine cashes this out as harmony grounded in number. And so, what does
Mhm.
it mean to say beautiful things please us through number? And why is that
Mhm.
not numerology but psychology?
Yeah. Augustine has a couple of starting points.
Yeah.
Um, so the fact that like can only be known by like and can only take pleasure in like. So yeah,
Mm,
I'm only gonna be pleased by something that is like me in some way.
mm,
That is a starting point. It's an axiom for him. And then harmony is another axiom. When he's talking about pain and pleasure, he just throws it out there that we can't help but be pleased if we
yeah.
encounter harmony. So, personal taste doesn't matter. You are going to be pleased when you encounter harmony for Augustine. And interestingly too, you might think that he means like once I've reflected on something and like sort of intellectually apprehend the harmony, but that's not what he means. He means like immediate sensory pleasure when I encounter harmony.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that is his starting point. And then when he breaks down harmony, he thinks of harmony as um, an arrangement of something such that, like, um, when you break it down, the smallest unit is going to be fundamentally like all the other units. Um, so he gives the example of like poetry and poetic meter.
Mm,
You break it down, and you get syllables that are fundamentally like one another. So because that's how he thinks about harmony, it's really this idea of unity or
mm,
equality that is pleasurable. And harmony is just, it's a composite entity that has like the most equality among its parts that it
mm,
can.
yeah.
And so it has the most unity that it can have. So number is Augustine's word for unity. And he's thinking about like the not like the idea of the unit. When he's talking about number, he means like the idea of the unit, which is equal to itself. So harmony and equality and number, they're not interchangeable when he's breaking them down, but when he's talking about pleasure and beauty, they're practically interchangeable.
Mm.
Yeah, so we can't help but experience pleasure when we experience harmony, which is essentially experiencing number. So the second part of your question was, why is that psychology rather than numerology? So Augustine thinks that all creatures have harmony, kind of like
Mm,
an intra harmony among their own parts. Um, and this harmony is what he calls order. And um, order, the harmony that I have among my own parts, my constituent parts, is what makes me one thing that doesn't just
mm,
disintegrate into,
yeah.
my constituent parts. And everything that exists as one thing has this inner order or inner harmony that makes it one thing. And that's the reason that it doesn't just disintegrate. But, of course, when he's explaining all this, he's talking about corporeal things. Corporeal things are things that have parts. But what I found is that he uses these principles when he talks about the soul. So the soul is not a corporeal thing, it's incorporeal. And so it doesn't, literally have parts, but he
Right.
talks about it as though it has parts. And the
Hmm.
parts that it has are its loves and desires. And just like all created things, the degree of harmony that I have can be greater or lesser. So the likeness, the fundamental likeness of my parts can be like more or less. And the same is true for the soul. So um, the more love I have for God, the more that all of my loves are rooted in the love of God, refer to the love of God, they are
Mm,
more and more fundamentally like one another. And that increases my soul's order, and increases its number, its unity. So the more number that my soul possesses, the more pleasure I'm gonna experience when I encounter um, number. And but like I said, true number is not found in the corporeal world. True number is God Himself. God is
mm,
the um, the entity who alone is simple and um, whole, and so. Uh, So this explains how um, I'm going to experience more pleasure in God, um, the more the more that my soul has order and harmony among its parts.
yeah. It sounds like the distinction that you're drawing here, but specifically referring back to the end of that question of numerology and psychology, is
Hmm.
that maybe in numerology it refers more to an external sense of unity, whereas it sounds like the psychology is this is a unity of the soul, and so
Mhm.
it's not necessarily in these parts as you're describing it outside of myself, but within myself.
Yeah,
Would
exactly.
you say? Okay.
Yeah, it's an intra harmony.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
it's harmony within
Yes.
myself.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. That's so interesting. And I think it's helpful too. I'm thinking even when you were talking a little bit earlier about unity and like parts,
Hmm.
it made me think too of the verse where it says that Christ did not count his equality with God as something to be grasped. And so
Hmm.
there's a level of likeness there, but in this it sounds like in Augustine's framework that we're using here, that is part of the pain that he went through was not immediately gaining that pleasure from the like thing of he is like God, but rather he experiences the pain of human death. I don't know. I don't. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but
No, sure. Yeah, I mean, Augustine calls the Son of God. He calls him likeness itself. Um,
yeah.
he is the perfect likeness of the Father.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Well, so let's move on to the third locus. So this involves two go-betweens. So the pneumatic material, which you've sort of already mentioned, and then also the psychological image. So how do
Mhm.
these bridge the incorporeal soul and the corporal world? And why do you think that Augustine needs both?
Yeah. So, Again, Augustine takes it as axiomatic that like can only be known by like. So the
Yeah.
soul is incorporeal and the rest of the world that I perceive is corporeal. So there has
Yeah.
to be a kind of mediating mechanism for the soul to
Mm.
perceive the corporeal world. So one part of that mediating mechanism is pneumatic material. So pneumatic material, again from pneuma, and the translation that we know of spirit is really helpful here because Augustine and other ancient thinkers considered pneumatic material, is kind of like the in between between
Mm.
like something that's really
Yeah.
corporeal, like it's solid, um,
Right.
and something that's not. And so Augustine thinks that this pneuma, this pneumatic material that's pulsing through my sense organs, is kind of the halfway point between corporeal sensibles and the
Mm.
incorporeal soul. It's a little like both.
Yeah.
And in fact, um, he thinks that pneumatic material changes a little bit depending
Mm.
on what sense organ it animates. So it gets kind of wet and misty when it's like in your nose, and it's like airy when it's in your ears. And so it that shows that he's thinking about it taking on qualities like
Mm.
corporeal sensibles. But on the other hand, it's the thing that's most like the soul because
Mm.
it's so rarefied. So pneuma works as an intermediary by being a little like this and a little like that, a little like the soul,
Right.
and a
Yeah.
little like the things that you sense.
Mm.
But yeah, that's only, as you alluded to in your question, that's only one part of the mechanism. You asked me, why do I think he needs both? Um, on the one hand, it's like, well, he's just like following everybody else. He's not making
Yeah,
this up.
sure.
So
Right.
like everyone's talking about these things.
Yeah.
Um, but I will say that um, when he's talking about pneumatic material, that concept comes up more when he's talking about pain and pleasure. And I think that makes sense because we tend to associate pain and pleasure with contact, with touch.
Mm. Yeah.
So pneumatic material is like how I explain the contact
Yeah.
between the incorporeal soul and the corporeal world. But when you talk about another aspect of sense perception, like vision, um, it's not that contact has fallen away, but now vision has to do with images.
Yeah.
So his focus is on something else. And so the other part of his theory, he thinks that when I perceive something, when the sensible um, and my sense organ encounter each other, the the sensible thing leaves an impression in my sense
Mm.
organ. An impression how we think about impressions in clay or in wax, leaves an impression.
Right.
But he'll say that when the sensible encounters my sense organ, the impression is like something in water, not wax, but
Mm.
water. And he uses that illustration because an impression in water is there when the object is in the water. But the minute you pull the object out of the water, there's no more impression.
Sure.
So the impression in my sense organ is like that because it has to be constantly changing
Yeah.
to capture the constant like flux of the
Right.
sensible world. But what Augustine thinks happens is that um, the instant that there's an impression in my sense organ made by a sensible, my soul creates a copy of it.
Mm.
Um, and this copy is what I call the psychological image. And I call it the psychological image because Augustine is very clear that this is not a corporeal image. What's happening in my sense
Right.
organ, that impression, that's corporeal. That's like
Sure.
pneuma, which is corporeal, and the sensible, which is corporeal. But the copy that my soul creates, it makes out of its own substance, he says.
Mm.
So it's an incorporeal copy.
Yeah.
And so the soul has to do this because it needs to retain all of the constantly fluctuating impressions that are being received in the sense organ. And it presumably too, the soul is incorporeal, so it's perceiving an incorporeal image. It's perceiving what's like it.
Hmm. That's so interesting. The way you're describing this reminds me of like when you smell your grandma's perfume.
Uh-huh.
And, I'll pass a lady in the store, and she might be wearing the same perfume my grandma used to wear, and it's kind of this tactile, corporeal, like, it's my senses, nose, my sense of smell is being activated, and kind of like to relate it to the metaphor of the water, while I'm smelling that, I have this psychological image of my grandmother. But as soon as the smell is gone, while the psychological image is still there, the imprint is no longer there.
Yeah, the psychological image you retain,
Yeah.
um, even when the physical impression or the corporeal impression is gone.
Is gone, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why we need it because,
Right.
we gotta remember, what happened,
Yeah.
a millisecond ago.
Right. Yes, 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 yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you for that. That's really helpful. And I think these three loci just really work well together to paint this picture of Augustine's sense perception, but specifically within, as you're describing it, the corporeal and incorporeal realms, that in the way
Mhm.
that they work together. So
Hmm.
that's really helpful. So let's move on to moral psychology, where you describe habit as an accelerating cycle of motion. So going back to these cycles of motion that are happening within the soul.
Mhm.
So this is a cycle of motion that stores force in memory and shapes future ascents. So
Yeah.
what pastoral or practical implications do you draw from this? And I'm thinking about these motions like addiction as
Yeah.
maybe a negative example, but then
Uh-huh.
also spiritual disciplines as maybe a positive example.
Yeah. I mean, according to this idea, every moral action that we take has a consequence.
Mm,
Um, and that can be really bad news, and it
yeah.
can be really good news.
Right.
Um, it's really bad news when, um, I, keep snapping at my kids and scrolling social media because I'm stressed out. But I think, well,
Mm,
I've got a handle on it. Like as soon as these stressors resolve, then I'll do better. Augustine would say, well, maybe not, because
right.
every action that you take
Yeah.
is leaving that momentum, those patterns
Mm,
of movement in your soul.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's bad news. We have less control than we might think we do over
Right.
our ability to control our vices. Um, but yeah, on the flip side, you mentioned spiritual disciplines, and I think about those times that, like, I certainly experience as a person of faith myself, where um, like I'm just not feeling it. you know,
Yeah.
um, I
Mhm.
don't I don't want to pray and I don't feel like going to church and I don't
Yeah.
want to do those things. But if I keep at it, if I keep
Mm,
doing them,
mhm.
um, again, according to these same ideas, like I will reap the reward eventually. I've preached on this before, actually, that every action every action I take reinforces the love that prompted that action in the first place. And that is
Mm,
what Augustine's theory is all about. So,
yeah.
yeah, that's very pastoral. And Augustine
Yeah.
makes me a better Christian, I think.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. And in some ways, you might even describe it as like a consequence of your action is
Hmm.
not always negative. And also in the same way that we kind of made the distinction with the interruption in the animating attention, that these interruptions in motion are not always inherently negative or positive. And so I think
Mhm.
also going back to then this, that like these habits that we build, this motion, right? Like these
Mhm.
habits of, again, addiction or spiritual disciplines, that it's going to reap the rewards toward the end that it's working. And so
Yeah.
that is just it's so perceptive of you to pick this up from Augustine, but also Augustine to kind of pick this up and the way that you're identifying it as a metaphor, even outside of sense perception, it does become so pastoral, yeah, and
Mm.
practical.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So you paraphrase Augustine and you say, we're free to do what we most want, and what we want is shaped by habit and the congruence of God's call. So,
Mhm.
how does this avoid both the Pelagian autonomy that is just always kind of a temptation, and
Mhm.
then also fatalism?
Mm. Yeah. The congruent vocation is probably my favorite piece of Augustine's theology. I just think it's so genius. And maybe I'll start like it flows from his theory of action, which is not something that I saw a whole lot in scholarship, but um, Augustine has a theory of action where every action proceeds in three stages. So the first stage is an impression. So I encounter an impression. And an impression is some like environmental stimulus. Um, but well, environmental can be misleading because it could just be in my head. Like I just kind of get a
Sure.
thought in my head. But I can't do anything without first having encountered an impression. And
Mm,
Augustine is very clear that it's not within my control
yeah.
what impressions I encounter. And then um, the second stage of action is that I delight or don't
Mm,
in the impression. Oh, and
right.
I should say too that impressions have linguistic content. The Stoics would call this lecta, which means like a sayable. So meaning like if I walk into my kitchen and there's a cake on the counter, then the impression is not just the cake, but the impression is like I should eat cake. um,
Right.
there's kind of like this, like, yeah, this command to myself in the impression.
Right.
And then,
Sure.
yeah, like it either causes me desire or it doesn't. So desire is the second stage. And then
Mm,
the third stage is assent or dissent. So I, as a rational human being, can like reflect on my own desires and think, yes, I'm going to give into that one, or
right.
no, I'm not going to. And yeah, what's really interesting to me is that Augustine had this worked out really early. There are all kinds of debates about like the early Augustine, the late Augustine. But Augustine had this worked out really early.
Mm,
And you can see, I mean, I'm going to push my own argument here, but I think you can see a little bit the analogy that I draw with pain and pleasure, the
mm-hmm.
kind of this interruption, and
Yeah.
then you have to assimilate it. So, yeah, the genius of the congruent vocation is that, I mean, it prioritizes grace.
Mm,
In the congruent vocation, I receive a calling, which is
yeah.
an impression. Um, and it's not up to me whether I receive it or not. It's up to God.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, the whole problem is that I can't delight in God when I'm sinful. So he's
Mm,
calling me and calling me, and I can't delight in it um,
mm,
unless it's a congruent vocation. And
right.
Augustine means, a calling that's so suited to me. It's like miraculously
Mm,
suited to me. And when I teach it, when I teach this idea to my students, I tell them, it's the idea that God knows you so
yeah.
well that he knows the depths of your being. He knows you
Yeah.
better than you know yourself. So he knows how to call you so that you'll say yes, so that you'll find delight in the
Yeah.
call. Yeah, it's not up to me whether I receive a calling, and it's not up to me whether I can actually take pleasure in the calling. Uh,
Mm,
it's up to God. So that's how he really, prioritizes grace and
right.
avoids Pelagian autonomy. Um,
Yeah.
and he also really, he'll talk about how, like, if God wants to, God can call Saul, even though Saul
Mm,
is, out murdering people, out murdering Christians, and has
yeah.
no inclination to become a Christian himself. But God is not dependent upon
Hmm.
me and my prior goodwill. If he wants to call
Yeah.
me, then he knows how to do it. So yeah, he secures the idea that like God's will can't be frustrated there. You know,
Yeah.
God can call whomever he will. He also secures the idea that, like, no one is outside of the purview of grace,
Yeah.
because it doesn't depend on someone having a good will. Yeah, as to how it avoids, fatalism or determinism, that's a trickier one.
Mm.
Um, because there is a kind of fatalism, before conversion happens.
Yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
trapped. I'm trapped by my sinful habits, and God has to call me congruently, um,
Yeah.
to and he also describes it as, pouring love into my heart. There
Mm.
has to be
Mhm.
that moment that
Right.
the chain of sin is broken. But after that moment, there's where, like, Augustine's philosophy and his, like, logic is one thing,
Mhm.
and
Right.
his pastoral theology is, like, another,
Right.
and, um, once you convert, God calls you, like, it is your responsibility to
Mhm.
fan the flame of
Yeah.
that love that God has graciously given you.
Mhm.
And it's not as though you do that apart from the work of grace, but you put yourself in situations, and it's a funny point because Augustine is very clear that, like, we don't control what impressions we receive.
Mm.
Um, but presumably, like, we make choices that put ourselves in environments where we're likely to
Yeah.
receive certain impressions. I take myself to church and maybe I still can't control, like, what kinds of impressions I'm receiving, but I'm putting myself in a place where it's more likely that I'm going to receive impressions about God's grace and His love and everything, um, that are going to prompt my love and my desire, and then I can assent to all those impressions, and that's how I'm fanning the flame of that
Yeah.
love that God gave me.
Yeah. That's helpful. And I think you're right. Like the Pelagianism one, I think Augustine maybe is actively fighting against, right? But fatalism is kind of it's tricky because I think there is just like an aspect of that, like you said, pre-conversion, that we
Hmm.
are trapped in our condition, and so it is kind of a factor, I guess,
Hmm.
before coming to that grace. So well, so your title ends with the word becoming. So the title of the book is Seeing, Knowing, and Becoming. You end with becoming. And so, what does Augustine want us to become? And how would we know that we're on the way?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, especially the second part of it. um,
Yeah,
I think I can answer the first part of it briefly, which is that
sure.
he wants us to become whole.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm,
and the more that I love God, the um, more unity and wholeness I'm going to experience in myself, the more I'm going to move toward God as my final end,
yeah,
um, as a whole, versus, if my loves are all rooted in different things and referring to different things, then I experience a
right.
kind of fracturing in myself as the loves move toward their respective ends.
Yeah.
But yeah, how do I know that I'm on the way? Um, One thought that I have is, to what degree I see grace, like, at work,
Mm,
in my
yeah.
life, and around me, because Augustine thinks of conversion as a lifelong process. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I have that moment of the congruent vocation,
Right.
um, but that that has to be repeated, throughout my
Mm,
life, where I'm constantly, um, gonna face impressions, to the effect that God is gracious and I should submit myself, to His grace. So I think, yeah, how do I know? Maybe the more that I see that, and
mm,
the more able I am to assent to that
yeah.
impression, the more I know that I'm on the way.
That's beautiful. Well, and I think you've pointed through this whole conversation to just the theological richness of this sense perception from Augustine, and how it really is just organizing the thought and serving really as a metaphor. And so But I think we also have pointed to just some very practical and pastoral elements as well. And I love the way you answered that last question. And really,
Oh,
I hope
thanks.
that listeners and hearers and readers of the book will get that, that it is really it's about wholeness, and it's about bringing the unity together, kind of as you described, where your process began in this embodied way that's not
Yeah.
separated out into parts, but really is a unified and embodied whole. So it's beautiful, it's a wonderful, it's a really well done book. And so thank you so much for taking the time just to chat about this book, and to be here on the podcast today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And to our listeners and our viewers, you can purchase Amanda Knight's Seeing, Knowing, and Becoming at BaylorPress.com today. We hope you will purchase it and read just this lovely work. So thanks again, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.